This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm speaking to Sussex-based entomologist and wildflower expert Ralph Hobbs. Ralph has spent 40 years managing his garden for wildlife and has seen population peaks and troughs, new species come and older ones decline, the arrival of exciting wildflowers seemingly out of nowhere, and has spent decades observing what works for wildlife and what doesn't. He's here to share that with you now. Okay. What is your background? How did you become interested in wildlife and gardens?
I guess when I was a little boy and I was interested in butterflies. I don't know quite how, but certainly my next door neighbour was keen on butterflies. And my school teacher in my infant class was keen on butterflies. So somewhere in that combination, it started then and it's been the same ever since. And there's always something to learn about butterflies, even though you've been doing it for so many years.
Huh. And so you was that your professional work as well, was involved with butterflies?
Well, to start with, no. I did go to university and studied zoology with entomology. So that obviously was because of my interest. But from there, I then went into pesticides, simply because a job came up quite close to my parents' home, where I had to go back to after uni. And the chap who interviewed me was a dead keen entomologist. So we got on like house on fire, and I got my first job and went into pesticide research in the lab. Soon after that, though, I was transferred to Huntingdon, started off in Hertfordshire, and in Huntingdon, I worked for the Huntingdon Research Centre with the same company, but on a bigger project. And from there, whilst doing a project for a agrochemical company, I was asked if I wanted to join them instead, which I did. And that took me out of the lab and into field work, which is where I really wanted to be. And I spent 6 years with that company, again, research, but doing field trials. But it got me out and about all over Suffolk and Norfolk. And from there, I moved down to here in Sussex for the last 3 years of that period, and moved on then to working for another agrochemical company in this area.
Wow. So you're almost like a poacher turned gamekeeper. Is that what
yes, I've been called that a few times.
Yeah, I bet, because your garden's very wildlife friendly, isn't it now?
It is. But knowing about pesticides got me a brilliant job in the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, because I had to talk to farmers who were mostly commercially set up with arable farming and livestock, and talk to them about conservation. And unless you understand where a farmer's coming from, you get nowhere. So that was when I really felt I'd made it into the place I wanted to be.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. So obviously, you've always been interested in wildlife in one form or another. So as I mentioned, your garden is very wildlife friendly. Could you just describe it a bit? I'm not saying yours is a typical wildlife friendly garden, but perhaps you could start by describing what yours looks like.
Well, we've been there for over 40 years. And when I first got there, one of the first things I did was plant all sorts of food plants that butterflies and moths need. So I was planting lime trees and spindle, willow trees, that kind of thing, and a lot of nectar-bearing flowers. And foolishly, I put fertiliser on my front grass, which, coming from the agrochemical side, was kind of the thing that was done. I regret that and have done ever since. But despite that, I've still managed to turn it into quite a nice flowery grassland.
And how big's your plot?
It's pretty small. So we've got a front garden which is mainly down to grass, but with a natural native hedge along one side, and full of all sorts of plants. It's more like a botanical kind of collection in a way. And on the back garden, I've got a vegetable plot which has got more wildflowers in it than vegetables. And the pond we had, which is a very important feature in any wildlife garden, I put that in the front garden, and it succeeded through succession to a fen. And it's been a fen, and I've never seen the water since that first closed in. But the frogs still go there, and I can still hear them croaking in the springtime.
That's interesting. Yeah, obviously that's what a pond wants to be, isn't it? So is that advisable to let your pond go to that stage?
Well, if you've got a bit more space than we had, I would dig a second pond once your first pond starts to close in, or manage it every year, pulling out things and dividing things and recreating open water areas. You need the shallows, and of course that's the first part of the pond that fills up with plants. And it can be any of the plants. It depends on the season. What gets in first tends to oust everything else.
So it's obviously ponds are very useful things to have in a wildlife garden, but also you mentioned your garden's quite small. Is there a minimum size that you can have if you want a wildlife in your garden?
Even if you've got a balcony, you can have a few pots with some attractive plants in for insects and a bowl of water for like a mini pond, if you like. And you'd be surprised all the things that would visit that. The thing is, most people don't actually stop and look and study what comes and visits for very long. But if you were to do that and allocate an hour or two, you'd be surprised at the variety, even in a small place like that. So the bigger the better, but any size is good and worth having.
And is the key to it having a range of different habitats and plants within a space?
Ideally, yes. If you can have a native hedge, that's very good. You have to choose carefully where to put it, so you're not shading grassland, for example, where you're trying to get wildflowers established. And choose all the species that are good for wildlife, like your hawthorns and your blackthorns and your spindle, willows and those sorts of things. Privet's another good one.
Is it?
Flowers and berries, yes.
Right.
Good for wildlife.
And also buckthorn.
Old buckthorn, very good, yes. When I put them in our garden 40 years ago from little transplants, almost immediately the brimstone butterflies would find them to lay their eggs on, which is their only food plant in this area. But as I got bigger, I suddenly realised that the flowers are really important for all sorts of bees and other pollinators. And they flower for a very long season and absolutely buzz with insects. On a summer's day, you can hear it from the house, the buzz.
So obviously there are plants that are good for wildlife. Is there anything that you wouldn't have in your wildlife garden?
Well, quite a few things, actually. Anything that's at all invasive, that's difficult to control. But top of the list for me are creeping thistle. I wouldn't have that, but I would have other types of thistle, which you can dig out singly very easily. I wouldn't have nettles except in a contained area. In my garden, I haven't got enough room for that, so I don't actually have any, but of course that'd be very good if you've got a patch you can spare for them. Docks is another thing because they seed and spread so rapidly, and certainly not cleavers because they get everywhere and take over very quickly from seed. So every single plant I come across, I pull out of those. What else? Bindweed is a bit of a pain. It wraps itself around everything. So I'm continually pulling that, and I think I'm on top of that now, suppress it quite well by continuing pulling. There's always one that gets away, but and occasionally I let one flower on the trellis if the other things failed until the autumn, and then I get rid of it.
So starting with cleavers, I tend to leave those until just before. I'll leave them for a while. I only tolerate them for so long, but is it useful to leave it for a small patch of time?
Cleavers?
Yeah.
Not really.
No.
I don't think there's anything much that is totally dependent on cleavers.
Okay.
There are things that will eat it, but they'll also eat other bed straws.
Right.
And I have lady's bed straw, which is a good plant.
Yeah. And bindweed, does anything eat that? Because that's a kind
well,
of
the
import,
convolvulus hawk moths will lay eggs on bindweed. They prefer field bindweed, actually, to hedge bindweed.
Right.
The one in your garden tends to be hedge bindweed.
Yeah. Is the field bindweed the one with the pink flowers?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's quite pretty, actually.
Yes, but moths will feed from the flowers, the big white flowers.
Mm.
So you've got to be quite patient because the flowers don't come till about July time.
Yeah. Is there anything that you see a lot of in gardens? You look at it and you think that is absolutely useless for anything. I'm thinking roses.
Yes. Roses are not my favourite. I think people have far too many daffodils, especially all over the verges and everywhere you look in springtime. Very nice, but they tend to take over, where wildflowers and grass verges would be much better than lots of daffodils.
Right. I mean, that said about the roses, I do get leaf cutter bees taking chunks out of mine. That's about as much as I see.
I quite like next door's roses because I can see those, and they do. They do that there too.
Funnily enough, the leaf cutter bee has really taken to the Monge 2 plant this year in the polytunnel. I don't know why.
Oh.
They're obviously not that discerning.
No, I think they can take all sorts. Once they get onto one that works, they'll keep coming back for more.
Right.
I was very pleased to see a wool carderby this year for the first time. Not a rare thing by any means, but this was in next door's garden, and it was feeding on lamb's wool. Do you call it lamb's?
Lamb's ears.
Lamb's ears.
Stachys, yeah.
Stachys. And defending its territory from all comers. It would chase away bumblebees twice its size. It would chase away little bumblebees and hoverflies and everything. Just defending its territory. And it wasn't interested in the nectar. It was just defending its resource. Because, of course, it collects the wool from the leaves to line its nests for egg laying.
And if we didn't have the stachys in our garden, is there anything else that it would make use of?
There must be, but I think that's its favourite, as it's so woolly.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Wow. Overall, have you noticed a decline in the wildlife that visits your garden or that you see out and about? That would be the first part of my question.
Certainly out and about. I think it's pretty obvious that you can drive down country lanes with the headlights on and you won't see anything flying at night. I can remember as a kid seeing lots of things like snow in front of you in the headlights. And of course, the classic thing that you don't get them stuck on your number plate and your windscreen anymore. Just the odd occasional night you might get that happen. But it used to be a common occurrence. Every time you went out, you would come back with more and more insects.
Yeah.
So it's no surprise, really, that birds like swallows and house martins have declined so much. We just don't seem to have the biomass in the air anymore.
No.
Having said that, there's not many species which have actually become extinct as such. All these variety of insects seem to keep going at low levels of population compared with the past.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, are they more precarious because of the low levels?
Well, some of them must be. I think most of what we're talking about are the generalist insects, which aren't dependent on specific types of habitat or niches within those habitats. So things like flies and wasps and bees and those sorts of things, which are more general, and fly anywhere in the countryside just to look for their resources.
I've seen hardly any wasps this year.
No, not yet, not me.
No.
But I think they're there. I've seen the odd one.
Right. Just a bit
Yeah,
kind of late coming out.
And the odd hornet recently as well.
Yes. Well, of course, in Sussex, certainly, we've had very low overnight temperatures considering the time of year. I mean, it was 7 degrees the other night, which is very low. Also, I suppose sometimes you will notice a dip in one thing, like maybe the wasps, but then this year I've noticed loads of goldfinches. So do things come in peaks and
things
troughs like
do.
that?
Absolutely, they do, yes. I think they move around as well. Something like goldfinches would appear in one area and then use a different area the following year.
Right.
So it's quite hard to tell from just one person's observation, what is going on. So that's why it's so important that everyone sends in their records so that people who are studying the data can build up a true picture of what's really happening.
And where would you send in your records to? Are there kind of schemes?
Well, there's a Sussex Biological Records Centre, which will take all records of all species, and you can submit them online through iRecord, the app called iRecord, or any of the specialist apps which are associated with iRecord. Like there's one for grasshoppers and bush crickets, another one for butterflies, another one for ladybirds, dragonflies, and so on and so forth.
I don't do that, and I might shy away because I might think I don't know enough about the different types of wildlife to identify them.
That shouldn't be a problem because all of the records are needing to go through a verification process. I do the verification for Orthoptera, which is grasshoppers and bush crickets. Any sort of photo can be attached. It's very, very easy for most species to verify or re-identify in some cases, or occasionally just reject because it's just too impossible sometimes.
And is that nationwide as well?
The whole thing is nationwide, yeah.
Okay, so anyone can do
each
that.
Each county will have its own verifier for each group of species.
Yeah, and thinking about that, sometimes not necessarily from garden resources, but it can be quite difficult to identify things or to know what you've got. What would you recommend as a really good guide for people if they're starting out with absolutely no knowledge whatsoever?
It's very difficult to start from scratch and then try and do all wildlife. I think the answer is to find a group of insects or birds or plants that you're particularly interested, and just start with those, and then just get a good book on whichever group you think takes your fancy.
That's a good tip. Yeah, that's a really good
With
idea.
flowers, I always say this to people who can never remember the names. You'll tell them, and then a couple of hours later, you're at the end of the wall. What was that flower you said that was? There it is again. The way to get to know them is to pick one, take it home, put it in a vase on the windowsill, and look at it all hours of the day. Have it right in front of you, and you will get to know it. And it's surprising how that sticks.
Yeah, that's a good way. Actually, I had a book that encouraged you to pick a plant and to almost like take it to pieces and draw it and smell it, and you just
get to know
absorb it all. Yeah, that's a really good tip.
Yeah, but in a vase, you can see the buds opening and developing and turning to seed in some cases, and it really does help you learn.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So kind of moving back to the gardens, particularly wildlife gardens, I think some people think that a wildlife garden is one that you just let go and therefore is a low maintenance garden. Is that correct?
Well, there might be a few people doing that, and that is worth doing. But if you want a really rich wildlife garden, you've got to work at it rather like ordinary gardening. In fact, it sometimes can be a little bit more involved because you're letting certain things grow that appear by themselves from seed and pulling out the excess ones that you don't want, or pulling out the weeds that you don't want. And we have weeds, like we've already discussed. But the main thing is to overcome the urge to be neat and tidy. Straight lines and flat surfaces are just not nature. They're human artifacts. And we all pride ourselves in being neat and tidy and having beautifully decorated houses and so on. But don't extend the house into the garden. Let the garden do a lot of its own thing and just nudge it in one direction or another.
Yeah, I think people get a little bit scared because nature can take over so quickly that they feel they must keep this tight hold on it. And like you say, nature gardens, you have to know what you're looking at and what you're dealing with, and also be able to project how it's going to develop in the long term in your garden, how it's going to behave. So it can be tricky.
Yeah, in a way, but it's fun to actually see how it develops and not have too set an idea sometimes. So you can actually accept surprising things that turn up.
Yeah.
Or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So also thinking about gardens and their place in terms of biodiversity loss and decline, how important are gardens in the grand scheme of things? Are they actually going to help combat wildlife decline?
Well, I think if enough of us make an effort and begin to enjoy wildlife in our gardens, then yes. There are the generalist insects, which are a bit thin on the ground, which could suddenly have their populations raised back to how they used to be. For some of the rarer species, probably not so, unless you're in a certain part of the country, like on the Downs, where actually a little bit more downland, in a mini sense, in your own garden, can make a difference. As I say, and if enough people do that, most things are very mobile and can find these areas and make use of them, especially the nectar and the pollen.
In terms of the generalist species, I suppose, what are the most at-risk ones?
Well, we've had a very low ebb of small tortoiseshell butterflies in recent years. That's one example. Very much a generalist, only feeds on nettles. Nettles haven't declined. There are reasons why the decline is thought to have happened, which aren't to do with lack of habitat, but they certainly need plenty of flowering plants in our gardens. I think in that case, it's been more to do with parasitic effects, maybe even climate effects, because I think they've been doing better up north than they have in the south. But I'm pleased to say this year I've seen a lot more tortoiseshells than I've seen in the last 10 years, I'd say. So things come and go.
And how about birds? Is there anything that's particularly at risk at the moment that we might be used to seeing?
Other than house sparrow, which has declined quite a lot, and starlings, I think we can help those. And putting up nest boxes for both those species is a big help. With house sparrows, because they've declined so much over the last 10 or 20 years through lack of nesting opportunities, everybody's been redoing their roofs and blocking up cracks and crevices and so on. Gardens have become a very important place to put nest boxes for house sparrows. And in my case, I've been putting up more and more, and I've now got 14 boxes, and nearly all of them occupied. One has got tree bumblebees in this year, which I'm quite pleased about. And the numbers have gone up from about 8 when we first started doing this to now well over 40 or 50 I see regularly. So it made a big difference. And of course, they eat an awful lot of birdseed. So I've kept that going right through the summer as well, just for the sparrows.
Well done. So is there anything people need to be aware of? Because I do occasionally think that I can't do right for doing wrong in the garden, because I think, I'll put up a nest box and then I read something and it says, you have to make sure it's facing this direction, you have to make it, otherwise the chicks will kirk. And I'm like, oh God, have I done it wrong? Are there things to watch out for in nest boxes?
Yes, don't put them in full sun. That's a big one, of course. And don't put them facing west into the sort of driving rain, which tend to come from the west. So up under the eaves is usually a good spot. It's a little bit more sheltered, and facing east or northeast, or maybe in the southeast. But I wouldn't put them facing any further south than that.
No.
Or west.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the tree bumblebees, they're from the continent, aren't they?
They were originally, yes. They came over naturally. And there was a lot of excitement when they were first found, I think in Hampshire initially. But since then, they've spread incredibly, and they're now well up into the northern parts. I'm not quite sure how far north, but become a very common species. Now one of our most common bumblebees.
Yeah, I spotted one in my garden a couple of years ago and I didn't know what it was. I'm hopeless with bees, but I did look up that one and I found that one out.
It is identifiable, that one, unlike a lot of them.
Definitely. In terms of creating maybe niche habitats in your garden, obviously you said it's probably useful to have a variety of habitats. I think you've created some very niche habitats in your garden, haven't you, with your troughs?
I have. I've set up some chalk grassland troughs and planted in quite a few species. So I've had to have at least 2 troughs to accommodate the number of plants that I wanted to use. And they are doing very well. And they're quite drought tolerant, as you would imagine, plants growing in chalk. So not a lot of maintenance needed on those 2. I've also created what turned out to be a wet heath trough by putting in peat many years ago, before we realised that wasn't the thing to be using in our gardens. And I seeded that with some wildflower seed from Emmisgate. But the most interesting thing that appeared was a load of heath-spotted orchids, which like acid conditions and may or may not have come with the peat or the seed, or even they may have just blown in from far away, as orchid seeds tend to move around so much.
That's incredible.
And that's been going ever since, and I've still got them going now.
Brilliant. Yeah, I spoke to somebody who wrote a book about growing orchids in the garden as garden plants, and he really recommended them and said containers are perfect. And I think a lot of gardeners wouldn't even think about that, would they?
Yeah, that's right. I've got common spotties growing out of all sorts of pots now, because the pots have lost their nutrients, become suitable for orchids, and they just arrive in seed blown in the wind.
Wow. And so seed would be the way you would get your chalkland plants going, for example, is it? Or would you buy actual
I did buy plant plugs, or I think some were given to me especially for planting in, yeah. So I even put in a small juniper tree.
Did you?
Just a dwarf variety. But the rest of the plants in there are all naturally wild.
Because sometimes it's not easy to buy native trees or shrubs, I find. Can you recommend anywhere to get them from?
Well, for native trees and shrubs, I think there's a place at Heathfield that does that, English Woodlands, and you can ask for local provenance. You may or may not get local provenance, but at least you'll get UK native. And for wildflower seed, in the Weald, we're lucky that we've got a Weald Meadows project, which can supply such things. Seed is harvested from local meadows. And you can also buy plant plugs locally produced. There are a couple of people around. You can Google them and find out.
Yeah, because I was reading something about hawthorn trees and it was saying that they're specific to that region. And if you get something that's maybe not from your region, it might flower earlier or later than your
exactly
instincts need it. That's a consideration as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but a lot of farms have planted all sorts of hawthorn stock. Right. So actually, with hawthorn, I don't think we worry too much because there's a wide variety of strains out there already. Not a lot we can do about that.
No, but it's food for thought, isn't it, I guess? Definitely, as you say, getting region-specific plants.
Amongst the wildflowers in people's gardens, if you plant from a national supplier, you may get seed from up north. And, of course, that flowers at a completely different time from down here. Knapweed and Devil's Bit scabious being obvious examples.
Huh.
They've got to flower early there because the winter comes sooner and they've got to get through their life cycle quicker.
Yeah. I was very kindly given some plug plants of native wildflowers, but they come from whales, and now I'm thinking, are they speaking the language of the local bees?
Yeah, but I think in a garden, it's not so bad. It's when you're seeding acres and acres of habitat that you need to be much more careful.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for sharing your expertise. Thanks also to you for listening. There are so many unknowns when it comes to creating wildlife gardens. If I could offer one piece of garden wisdom, I'd borrow a quote from Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, where he quotes American scientist, philosopher, and environmentalist Aldo Leopold, who said, "To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." In other words, sometimes we need to apply the brakes, sit back and observe what's happening in our environments before we rush full steam ahead into trying to fix them. Dr. Ian Bedford is here next, and quite coincidentally, but fittingly, he has a similar message.
Maintaining a chemical-free garden, whilst growing plants and flowers that provide protection and food for wildlife, can have many benefits. Not only because it will promote a balanced garden ecosystem, where problematic plant pests are kept under control naturally by the species further up the food chain, but it'll create an amazing environment for watching and learning about the many creatures that visit or live within our gardens, especially the bug life, which will abound if the conditions are right, and in particular, the dipteran insects, the true flies, which are identified from other flying insects by having just a single pair of wings. Dipterans are a group of insects that are certainly worth a closer look, because far from just being a buzzy nuisance pest around the house, they've evolved and diversified over hundreds of millions of years into many different taxonomic families and species of fly. And these have become highly adapted to the roles they play within the different ecosystems, whether it's consuming the dead or feeding from the living. And consequently, the different species have perfected their often unique, but sometimes peculiar, behavioural and survival traits. None more so than the dagger flies, of which we have over 200 species in Britain, many of which can be seen within our gardens. Dagger flies are mostly medium-sized predatory flies that are dark and rather bristly in appearance, but their most distinctive feature is a long pointed mouthpart that they use to attack and pierce their prey with. Often seen hunting amongst the garden plants for insects such as caterpillars, leafhoppers and bees, they can also be found resting on a flower and drinking the nectar. But what makes the dagger flies different from other predatory flies is their very peculiar mating ritual. At certain times during the summer, the males will each go off to find and capture an insect, but not to eat it. Instead, they hold their dead or dying victims beneath them as they swirl around each other in small groups above the plants. And they continue this aerial performance until a female appears, at which point the males jostle to display and offer their catch to her. Choosing the male with the most impressive gift and ignoring the cheats that have been carrying plant seeds, the female will lead him in amongst the foliage to mate, while she gorges herself on the victim. Then, with their bizarre mating process complete, the female will leave to begin laying her eggs into moist soil and rotten wood, where her resulting larvae will predate on other ground-dwelling creatures, growing and developing into the next generation of daggerflies.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.